Tonight's lecture is over evolution and extinction. On a crisp December morning in 2013, representatives of several federal agencies met on Andersen Air Force Base in Guam, a South Pacific island in U.S. territory, to watch an experiment that sounded more like science fiction than science. As they looked on with binoculars, military personnel in a small fleet of helicopters dropped dead baby mice one by one into the surrounding jungle. The mice had been laced with acetaminophen and fitted with lightweight streamers that served as mini parachutes. The mice could be thought of as paratroopers in a war that the island had been fighting for half a century against a most elusive yet devastating enemy, the brown tree snake. Introduced accidentally from other Pacific islands to Guam through ships sometime back in the 1940s, they have driven almost all of the island's native bird species to extinction. The mouse airdrop was part of an effort to decrease the snake population. Acetaminophen is lethal to snakes. The parachutes would ensure that the mice would catch in the trees where the snakes would live and eat. Operation Mouse Drop is just one of the many tools currently employed to address the problem that has plagued wildlife biologists for half a century and that, for years, has been shrouded in mystery. So it was the late 1960s when the birds of Guam began dying off with disturbing speed. By the early 1980s, 4 species had gone extinct. 10 others were in danger of joining them. And wildlife experts had no clue why. Early hypotheses of this mystery, such as diseases and/or pesticides, did not pan out, but the locals were certain that brown tree snakes, non-native snakes up to 6 feet long, were responsible for the birds' demise. Biologists began to investigate whether these reptiles might be causing the extinctions. Could just a few snakes really obliterate a whole island's worth of birds? And that brings us to key concept number 1. Populations can adapt to a changing environment when individuals whose inherited traits make them better suited to survive or reproduce, leaving more offspring with those traits on average than other less suited individuals. This is a process known as natural selection. I'd also like to point out that individuals do not evolve. Only populations evolve. Before they started disappearing, Guam was home to 18 native species of birds, each specially suited to life on the island. The process by which organisms best adapted to their environment survive to pass on their traits is known as natural selection. Evolutionary biology helps us understand the diversity of life on Earth and how populations change over time. It is one of the pillars of biological sciences and has been elevated to the level of scientific theory by the vast amount of evidence that supports the occurrence of evolution and mechanisms by which it happens. So for most populations, more offspring are born than can survive, since resources are limited and many species produce large numbers of young. Since only some of those individuals will survive over time, the population will contain more and more of these better adapted individuals and their offspring. So populations usually contain individuals that are genetically different from one another. According to the evolutionary theory first put forth by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, a selective pressure on a population, that is, a non-random influence that affects who survives or reproduces, favors individuals certain inherited traits over others, such as camouflage, tolerance for drought, or an enhanced sense of smell. These individuals have differential reproductive success compared to other individuals. They leave more offspring than those who are less suited for their environment. So ultimately, this changes how common certain variants of genes are in the population. These variants are called alleles. The frequency, that is the percentage in the population of some alleles, increases and that of others decreases. When this occurs, the population has experienced evolution or changes in gene frequencies within a population from one generation to the next. Natural selection may be stabilizing, directional, or disruptive depending on which genetic traits are favored or selected against. It is important to note that individuals are selected, but populations evolved. Individuals do not change their own genetic makeup to produce new necessary adaptations, such as a bigger size or pesticide resistance. If they get the opportunity to reproduce, they pass on their traits to the next generation. If they cannot tolerate environmental changes, as was the case with the first bird species to disappear from Guam, they die off or fail to reproduce and do not pass on their genes. Individuals may be able to adjust their behavior to accommodate environmental changes, but if a trait is not genetically controlled and therefore is not heritable, it cannot be passed on to the next generation. And that brings us to infographic 1A on page 105. When the environment presents a selective force, such as a new predator, changing temperatures, a change in the food supply, etc., natural selection is the primary force by which populations adapt. The survivors are those who were lucky enough to have genetic traits that allowed them to survive in their changing environment. Others who do not possess the trait were not as likely to survive to reproduce. Because survivors pass on those adaptations to their offspring, the gene frequencies of that population change in the next generation, which means some traits are more common and others are less common than they used to be. When this happens, the population is said to have evolved. And that brings us to infographic 1B on page 105. Natural selection can have different outcomes depending on what varieties in the population the environment favors or selects against. And that brings us to key concept number 2. Genetic diversity in a population is the raw material on which natural selection operates. The more diverse a population, the more likely there will be individuals present who can withstand or even thrive if environmental conditions change. So, the ability of a population to adapt is a reflection of its tolerance limits to environmental factors, which largely depend on genetic diversity. That is, different individuals having different alleles. A population that is highly diverse has individuals with many inherited differences and is likely to have wider tolerance limits when it comes to the environment. And this increases the population's potential to adapt to changes. This means it is more likely that some individuals will exist that can survive or even thrive in the changes, and the population as a whole will survive. If a change occurs that produces a condition outside the range where individuals can survive and reproduce, for instance, the climate becomes warmer than anyone can tolerate, the population will die out. Similarly, if a new challenge is presented, such as the introduction of a new predator or competitor, the survival of the population will depend on whether there are any individuals in the population who can effectively deal with the new species. If the snakes on Guam were indeed responsible for killing the birds, any birds that happen to have effective snake avoidance behaviors would have a greater chance of survival. So 2 main sources of variation can increase genetic diversity in a population. The ultimate source of new variability is genetic mutations, a change in the DNA sequence in the sex cells that alters a gene, sometimes to the extent that it produces a new trait. Mutations are rare, but because DNA replication and repair occur all the time, these rare events add up. When a mutation produces traits that are beneficial, they can quickly be passed on to the next generation, allowing the population to evolve to be better adapted to its environment. A second source of genetic variety occurs as eggs and sperm are made. Genetic recombination shuffles alleles around and sometimes produces individuals with new traits when a sperm fertilizes an egg. The value of this genetic diversity is illustrated today in the example of the rock pocket mouse of the American Southwest desert. Animals of this species have coats that are either light tan or a darker color. It turns out that a coat color corresponds to the population's environment. Areas of light-colored rock contain populations with mostly tan mice, whereas darker mice inhabit the black lava rock regions. Research by evolutionary biologists has shown that coat color is determined by a single gene that comes in two different alleles. The dominant allele is designated by the uppercase letter D, and the recessive allele is designated by the lowercase letter d. All individuals have two copies of a gene, and the color of their coat is determined by which two alleles they possess. Darker mice have at least one dominant allele, so their genotype is D, or D lowercase d, and tan mice possess two recessive alleles, lowercase d. So the D, and the lowercase d, those individuals are what we call homozygous for this particular allele. On the other hand, the D, lowercase d, those individuals are known as heterozygous for this particular allele. It is likely that color coat provides camouflage and protection from visual hunters, but only if the mouse is on a background of the same color. A study on deer mice, which is a similar species, showed that predatory owls are more successful at capturing mice on a contrasting background. This gives support to the conclusion that coat color is adaptive as camouflage and therefore is responsive to natural selection. And that brings us to infographic 2 on page 107. Natural selection produces populations with different gene frequencies, more or less of a particular gene variant or allele. For this to occur, there must be genetic variation, that is, more than one allele for a given trait, and a selective pressure, that is, a reason one variant is better than another in a given situation. Moving on, a study done with dark and light variants of deer mice revealed that owls caught twice as many opposite-colored mice, that is, dark mice on a light background or tan mice on a dark background, as mice whose coloration matched their background, even in almost total darkness. Owl predation is therefore likely to be a strong selective pressure on coat color, driving directional selection that produces either light or dark populations of mice depending on the background. And that brings us to our key concept number 3. Two species can become highly adapted to each other when each becomes the selective pressure that favors certain traits in the other, a process known as coevolution. Species that never co-evolved with a particular predator or competitor may not have the traits needed to survive if that species invades their habitat. So a special type of natural selection known as coevolution occurs when two species each provide the selective pressure that determines which of the other's traits are favored by natural selection. Predator and prey species usually evolve together, each exerting selective pressures that shape the other. As predators get better at catching prey, the only prey to survive are those a little better at escaping, and it is those individuals that reproduce and populate the next generation. This game of one-upmanship continues generation after generation, with each species affecting the differential survival and reproductive success of the other. The result can be a predator extremely well equipped to capture prey and prey extremely well equipped to escape. So non-native species that cause ecological, economic, or human health problems are hard to eradicate and are considered invasive species. And they can cause significant damage in the areas that they invade. In fact, invasive species are one of the leading causes of species endangerment worldwide. If the birds on Guam were indeed eradicated by the invasive snake species, it was because the speed at which the eradication happened prevented the bird populations from potentially co-evolving survival strategies to deal with the new snake populations. The brown tree snake was already well adapted to preying on birds, But Guam's bird populations had never faced such a predator and had no natural defenses. It was an unfair fight, and, like populations worldwide that are isolated on islands or mountaintops or by fragmented habitats, Guam's populations were further handicapped by their isolation. They rarely, if ever, received new individuals from populations elsewhere. Indeed, some of Guam's species were endemic, found nowhere else. Thus, no other populations even existed to contribute new members that might be better adapted to the snake. So some of Guam's bird species were extinct sooner than others. For instance, the endemic birtled white-eye, the gregarious bird species that was extinguished first, was very small, raising the possibility that the small size of these birds might have put them at a disadvantage. Larger species, like flycatchers, survived longer, though most of them, too, eventually disappeared. Other bird species experienced extirpation. For instance, the Guam rail is gone from Guam, but other populations still live on the nearby island of Rota. If some individuals of the birtled white-eye or other extinct species had been able to avoid the snake, perhaps due to a heritable trait that made them more wary of the predator, their descendants might have produced new populations that could cohabitate with the snake. When populations diverge because of isolation, food availability, new predators, or habitat fragmentation prevents the ability of the population members to freely interbreed, new species may arise. This is called speciation. This increases the number of species in a community and sometimes produces specialists that can exploit open niches. This separation may be physical, for instance, geographic boundaries the individual won't cross, or may arise when something prevents some individuals from choosing others, such as mates, and this may happen when individuals spend their time in different parts of their habitat. However, not all evolution is driven in this manner. Random events do play a role too, typically by decreasing genetic diversity rather than increasing it. And that brings us to our infographic number 3 on page 109. Coevolution allows populations to adapt to each other. And that brings us to our key concept number 4. Along with natural selection, random events such as genetic drift, the bottleneck effect, and the founder effect also influence the evolution of a population. So in genetic drift, some traits or alleles are passed on or lost by random chance, not because they were selected for or against, as is the case with natural selection. How could this happen? Even with natural selection at work, in each generation, some individuals may leave more offspring than others, not because they were better adapted to the environment, but because they got lucky, perhaps due to favorable external factors. They mated more, had more offspring, or had more offspring survive. Others might be unlucky, that is, they might be in the wrong place at the wrong time, like killed by a mudslide before having a chance to mate. Just because natural selection would favor certain traits over others doesn't mean every better individual will leave more progeny than all the less well-adapted individuals. The best traits might increase one's chances of survival or reproduction, but no trait guarantees it. Small populations are much more likely to experience genetic drift than large ones because the offspring of a few lucky individuals will have greater impact on the gene frequencies of the next generation in a small population than a few lucky individuals in a large population. In large populations, the effect of genetic drift is more likely to be masked by all the better adapted individuals who are favored by natural selection and successfully reproducing. In small populations, genetic drift can quickly lead to losses in genetic variability that produce major evolutionary changes in a population. Moving on, genetic drift is more likely to happen if a population has experienced a reduction in size as occurs with the bottleneck effect. When only a subset of the original variants reproduces, they can give rise to a new population that is different from the original population. The bottleneck effect can occur when a portion of the population dies, perhaps because of a natural disaster like a flood, or because of a strong new selective pressure, such as the introduction of a new predator. The survivors then produce a new generation, and any alleles that were found only in the deceased individuals are lost from the population forever. Moving on, the founder effect also reduces population size and therefore available alleles. Consider the situation in which a small subset of a population colonizes a new area. If this subset, the founding population, happens to be less genetically diverse than the original, and if the subset becomes completely isolated from the original group such that there are no mixing of the two populations and no chance to reintroduce those missing alleles, the founding population will produce a population that has different gene frequencies than the original population. Today, human impact increases instances of both the founder effect and the bottleneck effect. Much of what we do isolates populations into smaller groups, forcing them into these situations. And that brings us to key concept number 5. In artificial selection, humans choose which traits to keep and which to eliminate from a population through selective breeding. Our actions have also inadvertently led to the evolution of antibiotic or pesticide-resistant populations. So humans can directly affect evolution of a population through artificial selection. Artificial selection works the same way as natural selection, but the difference is that the selective pressure is us, or humans. For many animal and plant species, humans choose who breeds with whom in an attempt to produce new individuals with desired traits. By doing this over many generations, people have accentuated certain plant and animal traits, sometimes to extremes. For instance, artificial selection created domestic dogs from their wolf ancestors. But evolution is ever at work. Pesticide and antibiotic resistance populations can emerge as an inadvertent human influence selection. When we apply a chemical that kills a pest or pathogen, some individuals survive because of their genetic resistance. That is, the individuals were already resistant even though they had never encountered the chemical. These survivors are then the only individuals who reproduce, producing the next generation that is also pesticide resistant, ultimately changing the frequency of resistant genes in the population. And that brings us to infographic number 5. Humans use artificial selection to produce plants or animals with desired traits. And that brings us to our key concept number 6. The pace of evolution and extinction is generally slow and is affected by population size and genetic diversity, reproductive rate, generation time, and the strength of the selective pressures at play. When extinctions unfold over long periods of time, better adapted species tend to replace their predecessors and the niche remains filled. Rapid extinction events may eliminate well-adapted species and break important community connections. So the pace of evolution by natural selection is not constant or the same for all species, but in general, it is slow. Changes accumulate over generations, and speciation events can take thousands or millions of years. Evolution's pace is affected by a variety of factors, including population characteristics such as genetic diversity and size of the population, aspects of a species' biology such as its biotic potential, the maximum reproductive rate, and generation time, and the strength of the selective pressure a population is facing. As mentioned earlier, genetic diversity is important because it provides options for natural selection to favor or select against. If a new selective pressure favors less common traits in the population, or if a new favorable trait arises, it can quickly displace other variations in subsequent generations, resulting in evolution of the population. If this results in a speciation event, it can eliminate an ancestral species. When this happens, when a new species replaces an ancestral one, the outcome is unlikely to negatively impact the ecosystem because the niche is still filled. In addition to genetic diversity, the size of the population also makes a difference in how quickly natural selection can produce a change in the population. Beneficial traits can spread more quickly in smaller populations simply because it is more likely that the individuals with the trait will find each other and mate, as long as it is not a population that is widely dispersed. Of course, as mentioned earlier, smaller populations can also be at a higher risk of extinction because they likely contain less genetic diversity. Reproductive rate and generation time also influence how quickly a population can adapt to changes. Populations of R-selected species, that is, those with high reproductive rates and fast generation times, decimated by a disturbance or depleted resource, can quickly bounce back and repopulate the area because the remaining individuals can produce so many offspring in a single breeding cycle. Many endangered species, on the other hand, are K-selected species with slower reproductive rates and longer generation times. Therefore, they take longer to recover if the population numbers fall. Selective pressures that change over the course of just a few years can eliminate species with a generation time of many years. So there is simply not enough time for those to be able to withstand the stressor to grow up and produce progeny who can also withstand the stressor. The strength of the selective pressure also affects how quickly natural selection might produce a change in a population. One of the reasons the demise of the birds in Guam was so stupefying was that it happened so quickly, particularly for the small birds, which were the easiest for the snakes to eat. Larger birds disappeared later when the snakes started eating their nestlings and eggs. To determine whether the snakes were a strong selective pressure on the birds of Guam, researchers first had to be sure the snakes actually ate the birds. To test this, she set out bird-baited traps around Guam and on nearby Coco Island, which has no brown tree snakes. What she found shocked her. In one area of Guam, where the birds were extinct, 75% of the traps got hits within 4 nights. On the Cocos, all the birds used as bait survived. Surveys of Guam's abundance of small mammals also revealed heavy predation pressure by the snakes. Mice and shrews had declined by 94%. All in all, researchers amassed 3 lines of evidence that convinced them that they had finally solved the mystery of Guam's disappearing birds. The geographic location of the snakes correlated strongly with the birds' disappearance. Brown tree snakes were willing to eat birds and other small mammals and also went missing after the snakes' arrival. So the conclusion was that brown tree snakes were the culprit. The hunting skill of the snake and the lack of anti-predator behaviors in the birds made this new predator a strong selective pressure. A less proficient predator, or one whose hunting style was familiar to the birds, would have been a weaker selective pressure. Indeed, one lesson of the brown tree snake invasion is that while speciation typically occurs at a slow pace, extinction can occur much more quickly if the rate of change exceeds the ability of the population to adapt. These rapid extinction events are a concern because they can break community connections and leave unfilled niches, negatively impacting other species. This is, in fact, already occurring. 12 native bird species are now extinct or extirpated on Guam, including all the fruit-eating birds. This is having dire consequences for the island's trees, according to a 2017 study. According to this research, around 70% of Guam's trees are fruit producers and depend on mutualistic partners for seed dispersal. Unfortunately, in Guam, no other species have stepped in to fill this role. Researchers are estimating that the growth of new trees could be down as much as 90% due to failed germination of seeds. On the other hand, research has also revealed that spiders are flourishing without enough birds around to keep the numbers in check. Guam's forests are changing drastically, all because a few snakes found their way to this island. And that brings us to infographic 6 on page 114. The speed at which evolution can occur is influenced by a variety of factors. While the relationships below are not guaranteed to affect the rate of evolution as shown, for example, even a population with high genetic diversity would not be able to evolve or survive if no one in the population could withstand the environmental disturbance experienced. And that brings us to key concept number 7. Extinction rates were much higher in mass extinction events than at any other times. Past mass extinctions are linked to natural causes. Today, human impact appears to be causing another mass extinction. So extinction is nothing new on Earth. By most estimates, more than 99% of all species that ever lived on the planet have gone extinct. Based on a critical analysis of the fossil record, scientists tend to agree that there have been 5 mass extinction events. That is, when species have gone extinct at a much greater rate than during intervening times, each event leading to the loss of 75% or more of the species present on Earth. The most infamous of these was the extinction event that occurred at the transition from the Cretaceous to the Tertiary period 65 million years ago. Most scientists agree this event was set off by an asteroid impact in the Gulf of Mexico. More than 75% of all species, including dinosaurs, were wiped out. And that brings us to infographic 7a on page 115. There have been 5 mass extinctions in Earth's history, defined as extinction events, what eliminated a large number of species in a short period of time. Each is believed to have been caused by major environmental changes, such as the meteor that struck the Earth at the end of the Cretaceous period. So Earth's past mass extinctions were due to catastrophe events or physical changes to the atmosphere or oceans, which altered the environment faster than species' ability to adapt. Though most species that were lost didn't happen overnight, taking from hundreds to millions of years to unfold. These kind of events eventually led to the emergence of new species as surviving populations adapted to the available niches, a process that took millions of years. Cycles of extinction and evolution ultimately gave rise to the diversity of life we see on Earth today. Estimates range from 3 to 100 million species. Throughout most of Earth's history, the background rate of extinction, that is, the average rate of extinction that occurs between mass extinction events, has been slow. The fossil record tells us that on average, 1 or 2 species out of every 1 million species goes extinct each year. In a world with 3 million species, this would be 3 to 6 species per year. If the Earth is home to 100 million species, that would be 100 to 200 species per year. And that brings us to infographic 7b on page 116. The rates of species extinctions are well above that expected by the background rate, a trend attributed to human impact such as habitat destruction, the introduction of invasive species, and climate change. This graph shows estimates of extinctions since the year 1500 for vertebrates in comparison to the background rate of extinction. Accelerated extinction rates are seen for vertebrates, especially in the 19th century. So in Guam, the near total disappearance of birds between the 1960s and 1980s was a biological murder mystery. The brown tree snake was the cause of their demise, but the inadvertent introduction of the species by humans puts blame squarely on humans. Efforts to control the brown tree snake on Guam are ongoing and aggressive. As many as 15,000 snakes are captured annually. Control methods include baiting traps, canine tracking teams, and toxic mouse drops. There are even rapid resource teams that are deployed when a snake sighting is reported on a nearby island. The goal is not to eradicate the snakes, which probably isn't possible, but to control and contain them so they don't find their way to other islands. So there's a bit of a contradiction there. We've just talked about how we are living in the 6th mass extinction, and species are going extinct, and it's the humans' fault. But the book just said that the goal is not to eradicate snakes, which probably isn't possible. That's a quote verbatim from the book. It seems to me that if we are going through this rate of mass extinction, and if it is the human's fault, then it shouldn't be any problem to eradicate all of these snakes. Am I endorsing the eradication of all these snakes? No. I'm just pointing out that the language that we're using here is a little bit contradictory. And that brings us to our core message for this chapter. Variety of life on Earth is due to natural selection. Adaptation to change and extinction are natural. Human activities are impacting extinction rates. And now we'll summarize our chapter. An understanding of how populations evolve and how we can affect the process can help us avoid actions that create problems. By changing the environment, humans apply a number of new selective pressures on populations. Our changes have the capacity to be so rapid or so great that natural selection simply cannot keep up. The accidental introduction of the predatory brown tree snake is one such example. It introduced a major change basically overnight that decimated the vertebrate populations on Guam.